I'm a little bit of a different journalist. I write opinions and I give opinions, but I've also sort of as my other job, I'm a feature journalist. So I try and tell stories about important topics. So not just tell you what the topic is and the facts and figures, but a little bit of the background of the people who are involved in it. And hopefully that illuminates things. So what I'm going to do today is sort of give you a little bit of a story and a little bit about my journey through some of these recent topics that have driven my 2 books. And the story is actually going to start, in Guangdong province, southern China. This is a photo that I took in 2007. It's a junkyard in Guangdong, just outside of Guangzhou. And I had, at the point this was taken, I'd been writing about and reporting on Chinese recycling for about 5 years. And I was in Guangzhou to do a story. And the owner of this particular junkyard heard through the grapevine, because the scrap recycling world is if it's anything, it's gossipy. He heard I was in town and said, "You have to come and see my new junkyard." And so I said, "Okay, I love to see junkyards." And so he sent his car and picked me up and he drove me over here. And this looks like a junkyard. The interesting thing about it is that pile you see right there isn't just junk. That's actually what 3 helicopters look like once they've been run through a metal shredder in Los Angeles and shipped to Guangzhou. So that's the kind of thing I was accustomed to seeing during the 2000s. And Joe, who owned the scrapyard, he took me for a walk to see some other things. We saw this. Now, from a distance, I thought this was a bunch of extension cords, like you would use in your home. But as I got closer, I saw they were not extension cords. They were actually Christmas tree lights. And my jaw dropped. Now, I had been covering recycling for years, but I had never seen so many Christmas tree lights. And so I turned to Joe and I said, "You have to show me how these are recycled. What do you do with them?" And he said, "Why do you want to know this?" And I said, "Well, I'm thinking about down the line writing a book about recycling. And I think telling Americans what happens to their Christmas tree lights when they, are shipped to China would be a really interesting way to start a book." And he said, "Well, we don't really have time to go into that today, but next time you're here, we'll do it." Well, there wasn't really a next time. I'd asked Joe about it, and I sort of forgot about it until I actually got serious about writing this book around 2010. And then I started calling around to find somebody who could take me to see Christmas tree lights recycling in southern China. And the person who I came upon and was connected to was this man. His name is Johnson Zhang, and this was taken about 2011. And Johnson, what he did back then, and he still does it a little bit right now, though not during COVID, is he would get in his car and he would drive around the United States, mostly the United States, for roughly 6 months out of the year, going junkyard to junkyard to junkyard. And he would pay cash, usually a wire transfer, but certifiable funds for scrap metal in these warehouses. And he would then have them packed into shipping containers and shipped back to China. In one shot, he could go into scrap yards and spend $100,000 US. I was there with him for some of those transactions. So Johnson was very big into used Christmas tree lights to go back to China. So I started traveling with him, and he told me he'd show me what happened. So, you'd find little buckets of Christmas tree lights like this. This one was in Ohio. This batch, I remember quite distinctly, was in Indiana. And here's a bunch of Christmas tree lights in North Carolina. And that wasn't all of the Christmas tree lights in North Carolina either. And you can see Johnson walking around them. He's assessing them. And so after about a week of traveling with Johnson, I said to him, "Johnson, okay, I've seen there's a lot of used Christmas tree lights out there in the United States. Where do these things go?" And he said, okay, no worries. I'll hook you up. When you get back to China, I was living in Shanghai at this time, I'm going to connect you with my buddy, Raymond, who lives in Qingyuan, which is another town in Guangdong province. And he's got a Christmas tree light recycling line there. And so you'll go down and visit him and check it out. And I said, "This is great." So I got back to Shanghai. I called Raymond, and Raymond said, "Sure, come on down." And I was picked up at the airport and brought up. And if you've ever done anything in China, whether it's journalism or business, you know exactly what this is all about. Nobody's going to show you their factory, their operations, until you at least have one large meal with them some of their friends, some of their family and coworkers. And so that's exactly what this was. And like many scrap recyclers around the world, Raymond's business, and Raymond is the one guy who's not in this photo. He's somewhat camera shy, believe it or not. Raymond, it's a family business. It started as a family business, but it's a very big business. One of the individuals in this photo, I can't point to him because we're not in the same room, is his nephew, who had gone to a very good technical school in Guangdong. And rather than going on to being an engineer, he went into the family scrap recycling business. And he's the one who developed the recycling system for the Christmas tree lights. Now, you may ask yourself, why would you want to import Christmas tree lights from the United States? Well, we all know the story of recycling. We've heard the story. You know, the U.S. exports recycling to China, dumps it, some people will say, and was a very, very big business. If you look 2011, 2012, when I went to visit Raymond for this, it was really right around its peak. Why? Because as we all know, China is the world's largest manufacturer. If you need raw materials, you got to get them from somewhere to make your stuff. And so China would get them from scrap metal. And they would import anything, especially things that maybe people in the US didn't see value in, like used Christmas tree lights. And that's why somebody with a very good technical education would go into developing a system for recycling Christmas tree lights. So I'm going to show you a video right now of the system at Raymond's plant. And I think it's really cool. It's only about a minute and a half. It's edited. I'm just going to talk over it and tell you how Christmas tree lights were, and in some cases still are, recycled in China. So I hope you can hear me. What is going on here? You basically cut pieces of Christmas tree lights, throw them into those boxes. That's not smoke, that's steam, because there's blades spinning around very fast and they're chopping these up. And if you didn't have water going in there, it'd overheat and explode. What comes out is just this goop of water, plastic, copper, and glass. And that is shoveled onto tables that you can see are tilted upwards, and there's water flowing over them. And the light stuff, the plastic and the glass, washes right off for the most part. And the heavy stuff, the copper, you can see lingers further down, and that's how you separate it. And so you can see the copper falling off right there. And this concept, if anybody has ever tried panning for gold, it's the same idea. You just use gravity to basically separate your metal from the stuff you don't want. And you can see, the camera's going to pan down in just a second here. You can see what you get. It's copper and brass. So you start with a bunch of Christmas tree lights. You basically pan for gold, and you get this. People always ask me what happens to the stuff after it's been separated. Well, the insulation, at the time I took this video and met Raymond, the insulation was sold to a slipper sole manufacturer. So if you think about it, the slippers you may be lounging around at home in during work from home, may have been, last year's, well, not last year's, but maybe a few years ago's Christmas tree lights. And then the copper was cycled back into Christmas tree light factories. It was good copper for making Christmas tree lights and good brass. And so it could sometimes you run through that system again, and they could actually separate out some of that brass. And you can just see it a little better here, what's going on. So it's a really nifty system, very impressive, sort of low tech, but very sophisticated, and calibrating it takes about a year. And, like many people who cover this industry, it was beautiful. It was the circular economy. We always talk about the circular economy and needing to invent it. Well, to my eyes, at least, the circular economy was right here. You send the Christmas tree lights to China, they recycle them, they send Christmas tree lights back to you. And we all thought it would go on forever. But a couple of things started happening that made it clear right around the time that I visited Raymond that it wasn't going to last forever. And this is going to take us into the next stage of the story. Number one, China started getting old. And when it gets old, the workforce shrinks. So you have less workers entering the workforce. What happens when you have fewer workers? I call it the elephant in the Chinese scrap heap. Your wages go up. It starts getting more expensive. And this only goes to about 2015, but you see the point. Things started getting more expensive. If wages start going up, labor starts getting more expensive, you're going to see slower growth generally. And that's what happened. China started needing less raw materials because some of the manufacturing started shifting elsewhere. You would know this at Samsung, because Samsung has started shifting at least some of its manufacturing out of China. And then there was the other interesting side of this. This is United States municipal solid waste recycling and composting. So municipal solid waste is basically anything that goes into a garbage bin or a recycling bin, you know, green, blue bin that you would have in your home or in your office. And as you can see from this, the volumes kept growing and growing and growing, and so did the amount recycled. But still, Americans are generating more and more garbage, and they're recycling less and less of it. And with a large percentage of it, about 1/3 of it being exported, 2/3 stays home, about 1/3 of it being exported, you can imagine what was going to happen. And sure enough, you start getting inklings of a crisis in the mid 2000s. Now, I saw Raymond right here around 2011, 2012, for I've been back to see him since. And you can see what's happened since 2018. I mean, we're back to where it was when I first moved to Shanghai. And that's before this happened. China, you know, imposed a waste ban, basically. It's a little bit more complicated than that. You can still get some stuff in, but by and large, it's very difficult to get recycling into China anymore. And that happened before this. Now, if we had updated numbers, we'd see, you know, just a fraction of that. And so all of a sudden, this beautiful circular economy, and you know, it wasn't all beautiful. I've reported on this industry for almost 20 years, and believe me, I've seen the worst it can offer as well as the best, and the worst is pretty bad. But you did have this economy that we thought this market we thought would always continue, and all of a sudden, it doesn't continue anymore. Recycling isn't bailing us out of sort of this waste conundrum we have, this waste problem we have. China isn't able to do it anymore. And so I saw this coming a little bit. I didn't know they were going to ban things, but I could see the price of labor going up, and it was becoming harder to export. So I started thinking around 2015, what's the world going to do if there is not a place to send this stuff? You know, if there's nobody who wants to buy it anymore, if it's too expensive to buy, if people start manufacturing lighter and lighter goods. And of course, at Samsung, you know this because over the years, the things you make have become lighter and lighter because resources prices have gone up. It's a more sustainable product if it's lighter. It's easier to ship. What if there's less and less demand for the copper and the aluminum? And I didn't really have an answer in 2015, but what I did is I started thinking back on some of the other metaphors that I found in my sort of literary life and journalism life. And one place gave me an answer that I didn't expect. And so I want to go into this a little bit with you. Let me jump ahead. And that is Star Wars. Now, I know there's probably some people snickering right now, but bear with me because Star Wars actually really did make me rethink our global recycling economy, sustainability for manufacturing. And I have the proof. I'm not just putting you on here. I actually wrote a whole column about this transition for me for Bloomberg a while back. So you can see I'm not making this up just for Samsung. It really did happen. So let me tell you what I have learned about recycling from Star Wars, and then we'll get into some real world examples. If you know the movies, and I know the movies perhaps a little too well, you know that in every single one, pretty much, there's a junkyard or inklings of junk. This is episode 1, which wasn't the first one, but for the purposes of our discussion, I'll talk about episode 1. This is the first junkyard to show up in there. And what's really interesting, if you know anything about junkyards and recycling, is that it's a junkyard, but there's no recycling going on. Nobody's cutting things up so that it can be made into anything else. It's all just sitting around. Here we have episode 4, the original Star Wars film, and these are the Jawas. Now, I love the Jawas, and the reason I love the Jawas is my family came to the U.S. in the early 20th century, and they did what the Jawas did. They became scrap peddlers, scavengers on the streets of Galveston, Texas, and later Minneapolis, basically picking up whatever recycling they could find, putting it in their wheelbarrows, horse-drawn carts, trucks, and going and selling it. And so the Jawas have always reminded me a little bit when I see these scenes of my ancestors. And they, of course, if you know the movies, they go and they pick up these droids, C-3PO and R2-D2, and put them in their truck, their horse-drawn cart, if you will. And there they are. But again, you don't see this Sandcrawler is what it's called. You don't see any recycling going on in there. It's all just sitting there looking like it's about to be repaired. And that never made sense to me because I grew up in a place where if you found a piece of metal in my family, you immediately took it and you sent it to a recycler so it could be melted down and turned into something else. So it's an Empire Strikes Back where we start to get a hint of what's going on and what's going wrong with Star Wars recycling economy. This is a well-known scene with a Star Destroyer that's about to go into hyperspace. And Han Solo's Millennium Falcon is on the back of the Star Destroyer. And he tells Chewbacca and Princess Leia, we're going to wait until the Star Destroyer dumps its garbage, because it always does that before it jumps into hyperspace, and we'll drift off with it. So if you look at the garbage that gets dumped before hyperspace, look at that. That's not garbage. That's not plastic garbage bags. That's big hunks of steel, really nice steel. And again, you sort of have to ask yourself, wait a second, why aren't they recycling that stuff in the evil empire? Then we have, and let me jump ahead here. We have, oops, let me back up. This is from episode 7. This is a Star Destroyer that crashed on a desert planet. We'll see Rey in a moment. She's one of the scavengers, but nobody's recycling. That's a big hunk of steel. And what it reminds me of, if you've ever seen these photos, this is shipbreaking in India. And it reminds me of that, where people will take the big ships, run them up onto a beach, and you will have workers take them apart meticulously. But for some reason, in Star Wars, nobody does this. They just leave it there. And so that brings me to sort of my recycling, I call her my recycling spirit animal, if you will, Rey. She goes into, if you know episode 7, she goes into that Star Destroyer, and instead of going and taking, pieces of metal out of it, she goes and she takes pieces that have value to them, components, things that can be resold, used to repair things, and she sells them. And here's a scene where she's actually selling what she put into her land speed, or whatever that thing is called, to this guy, and what she sells them for is food rations. So we start to get an idea of what's going on in the Star Wars universe. People have decided, for whatever reason, that the raw materials, the metal, isn't worth anything. But the stuff that metal makes, the stuff that can be used to fix things or remake other things, has value. I've wondered for a long time, why doesn't steel or whatever a Star Destroyer is made of have any value in Star Wars? And if you go to episode 3, you actually get an inkling. There's a volcano planet, one of many, called Mustapha, where it's just an entire planet that's devoted to mining metals. And so there's a surplus. Essentially, metals are worth only what it costs to mine them. They're all free. The other thing that goes on in Mustapha, of course, is lightsaber battles, but that's another presentation. So in an economy where you have basically no value to your raw materials, people are going to start looking to garbage for what they can do to reuse and repair. And that's what you get in the Star Wars economy. You have people, pirates like Chewbacca, who knows how to repair a droid. So instead of like my relatives, who would have taken a C-3PO and probably ripped it apart and sold off the wire and the body to different types of metal recyclers, he knows how to fix it. Likewise, someone like Han Solo, another pirate of sorts, he knows how to fix an entire spaceship. He's got those kinds of skills. And then we have Rey, who is the scavenger out on this distant planet. Her job as a scavenger isn't to sell stuff for melting. She knows how to basically identify the value-added stuff in an old spaceship and sell it. And along the way, like a lot of mechanics over the years, she figures out how to work with that stuff herself. And so I started thinking, and I really had this revelation come to me watching one of the Star Wars movies. I began to think, is there this sort of analog on Earth? Are these sorts of things going on, in the United States, in China, in Canada, and other places where we're actually seeing, instead of recycling happen because of the crash in prices and the lack of demand for stuff, people are saying, hey, we can actually take old electronics, old cars, and fix them, and we'll sort of bypass the recycling economy and make things last longer. And I started to come up with an answer. And so the last third of this, I'm going to sort of show you, what I've sort of learned along the way. So back on Earth, specifically Vermont. Let me just take a sip here. This is a warehouse belonging to a company in Middlebury, Vermont, where Middlebury College is located, called Goodpoint Recycling. Goodpoint also has a facility in Brockton, Massachusetts. And they do what a lot of electronics recyclers do these days. They will manage state take-back programs. So the state will take back electronics from consumers to ensure that they're recycled properly. And Goodpoint will do a lot of that. But it will also go on the open market and buy stuff on tender. It will have, people drop off things. It will do drop-offs. And so some of the stuff that it takes in is actually still working, and they're not under contract to destroy it. So with a lot of the take back programs and some of the corporate programs, there is a contract that says you must destroy the stuff if you take it in. But some of the stuff they take in, they don't have to. And if it's used and working, and this is very important if you know law around this, they can then export it. And so the reason I came across Goodpoint was, in part, they are very proud of the fact that they export electronics, used electronics, to Africa, and specifically to Ghana. Now, a lot of people, when they hear you're exporting electronics to Ghana, think of this place. In fact, Africa and used electronics, this is probably the image or some form of it. This is a place called Agbag Bloshi in Accra, Ghana, in the capital. It's a large dump there, and it's been labeled incorrectly the world's largest electronic waste dump. It's actually where a lot of electronics in Accra, after they've been used for years and years and years, are disposed of, at least parts of them, like the wire, they'll burn off the insulation. But nobody's importing electronics into Accra just to set fire to them. That wouldn't make a lot of sense economically. It'd be cheaper to let them remain in Boston or San Jose or wherever you are and recycle them there. But I had sort of had a vague impression that this is a lot of what happens there. So I got to know the owner of Goodpoint. His name's Robin Ingenthron, and he brought me with him on to Ghana to see what happens. And I've gone back there several times since, and some of this is written about in the new book. But let me show you a little bit of what happens with the electronics that Robin exports after he makes sure that they're tested and working. This is a gentleman by the name of Olu Orga in Tamale, and that's northern Ghana, the capital of northern Ghana. It's the third largest city in Ghana, and it's also the fastest growing. And he's one of the people who buys Robin's and sells Robin's monitors and other equipment that Robin will sell into Accra. And he's standing there with a recent shipment. This isn't taken by me. It was taken by somebody who sent it over Facebook Messenger. I wanted to give you a very up-to-date photo. And they will sell these all over Tamale. Everyone from hospitals to schools, to small businesses, to banks, to families who want a computer for their kid. I'm not sure. I think there's probably people on the seminar right now looking around to see if there's any Samsung manufactured equipment there. Maybe somebody can tell me afterwards. I can see Dell, but I'm not sure about Samsung. And again, here are some desktops, and we know the market for desktops in the United States in particular is quite weak, much less for secondhand ones. He's taking these pictures to show the people who sent them to him that he's received them. They are out of the container. And he's also sending these pictures to some of his customers who he contacts via WhatsApp, because he also has retail customers where he'll sell one-on-one. But there's also people who get this material wholesale. And one of those customers is located here in Tamale, just so you can see what it looks like. This is the main street in Tamale. And the company I'm going to show you is located right in here. It's called Chindia Enterprises. And the owner of the shop is the gentleman in the yellow shirt, Camille Chindiba. He's a wonderful entrepreneur who has built a very nice business for himself, buying and selling used computers that come in primarily from New England. And then go out to all kinds of people in Tamale. He's not the only one who does this. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of these kinds of shops in Ghana itself. This is back down in Accra, the capital, and there's a company called Bujji Computers. It's quite small from the outside, though. It's longer than it looks, and it's a bigger business than it looks. This is one of 3 locations within central Accra where Bujji is located, and they do something really interesting. And this is where I started to see this is something more than just Robin sending tested and working machines to a developing country. That there is actually a repair economy happening here. You can see this is in the back office at Bujji. And these are, some of these are laptops that have been imported. Some of these are laptops that the owner of Bujji, his name is Steve Edison, has bought back from customers if they don't want them anymore, if they need to unload money. Some of these are computers that he bought back from customers after they stopped working. But from his perspective, they still have working parts in them. And because this is a low income country, they can sell, they can use the parts within these. And that's what I saw. And I took a picture the first time I saw it. It seems relatively obvious, but it wasn't to me. Somebody had brought in a computer where the monitor, the laptop monitor had gone out. So what they did at Bujji was they went to their library of laptops up there, found a monitor that would work, and basically plopped it back on. And this continued to be a working computer. And that's kind of the idea, isn't it? That, we want to see things last and from a sustainability perspective and be easy to repair. So that was the first hint to me that there's much more going on with all of the electronics in a place like Ghana than I thought. But let me then show you how I got even deeper into this and a little bit more hopeful that maybe we can replicate at least one part of the Star Wars economy. The man standing there with a television, and that's a Nokia television, believe it or not. I didn't even know Nokia had made televisions until I went to visit Ibrahim Al-Hassan. He's in a town called Savalugu, which is a village. They call it a village of about 30,000 people. It's about a 30-minute drive north of Tamale. So it's in the northern region of Ghana. And he's basically the television repairman of Savalugu. And he's a very popular fellow because if, everybody in Savalugu is using older televisions. You can see both of those are tube televisions, CRTs, and he's expert in fixing them. He's been doing it for 30 years, and that's almost as old. Almost as old as some of the televisions that he works on. The one behind him that he's working on, I'll show you a better shot of it in a moment. We figure is about 35 years old. The people you see standing around him, some of them are just the neighbors. They like watching him repair. He's so good at what he does, believe it or not, that it's kind of a spectator sport. So let me show you what he was working on the day we came by. This looks like a mess, and this is certainly something we would not fix in the United States. I don't know that we would find anybody who would be up for fixing it, but Ibrahim has an incentive to do it, to buy a TV like this in Ghana. Maybe it would be the equivalent of $7, $8, and fixing it is a couple bucks. And I don't remember what the issue was, but I do remember two things about this particular repair. One, this TV is so old that it's a manual channel change. So there's no remote control. You actually have to turn the dial on it. So as I said, probably about 35 years old. It had stopped working. And so what Ibrahim said was, hey, look, I can fix this for you. And while I'm at it, how about I turn it into a remote control TV for you? Now, that's a very sophisticated repair to begin with. But second, he doesn't have the parts. You don't necessarily have the parts. Whatever this was, it might have been a Sony. I don't remember. But you don't necessarily have the parts or a kit to do that. Where did he get the parts to do it? If you look over his left shoulder, you'll see a shed with a bunch of TVs in it. These are TVs that he might have tried to repair in the past. They couldn't be repaired. There's TVs he might have bought for parts, and that happens all the time. If a TV breaks down, he and other repair people in the northern region of Ghana, they'll compete to get them because they're used parts. Whatever it is, he's become sophisticated enough, and he's enough of a walking encyclopedia of these kinds of televisions that he was able to locate the right TV to make it work, and he's able to actually turn this television into a remote controlled television. He's not the only guy who does this. Just as one example, back down in Tamale, here's another shed full of TVs. These are not waste. These are not junk. This is inventory. This is a library of parts. The repair people of Ghana keep everything. And these are flat screens, which is the other reason I'm showing it to you, because the more affluent parts of the northern region are starting to see flat screens, and they're starting to break down. And so people want to get the parts. And the actual repairs are incredibly sophisticated. This is Robin Ingenthron, who is the exporter I told you about. He exports the used, tested, and working stuff. He's standing there with the guy, his name's Steve, who's widely acknowledged to be the most talented repair guy in Tamale, which is saying something because there's hundreds of them. And this isn't just putting remote controls into old TVs. If a circuit board goes out and the pins are broken or melted, if the pins are misaligned on a chip, he's got the equipment. And I think some people have seen this. This is an actual device that helps you realign the pins on chips so that they can be put back into electronic devices. And the reason I got to know him is because I actually blew out basically my laptop there in Tamale because the electricity is so uncertain. And one of the chips partly melted from the heat. And he was actually able to do a repair using that machine in Tamale, which is an incredible thing to do. I don't think you would find anybody able to do that on a retail basis, at least in the United States. So let me bring you back now to Burlington, Vermont. And this is where things get really, to me, quite interesting. There's an obvious need in developing regions, and it's not just northern Ghana, but there's a need and demand for parts. To fix the things that go over there, the used and tested things, the things that they buy retail there. I remember quite distinctly there was a Samsung store in downtown Accra, Ghana. Sometimes if those Samsung devices end up in Tamale, it's going to be hard to get it repaired back down in Accra. And I'm guessing there's not authorized repair up in Tamale. People want the parts. So what Robin realized a few years ago when the price of recycling started going down, when we went into this recycling crisis, is that he has a warehouse full of used devices that maybe nobody will buy, but there's still parts within them. And so he started basically pulling parts, is what we call it, and taking pictures of them and putting them on eBay. And he will sell these days. It's growing. It's a business that grows, I believe, about 20% every year. He will sell thousands of these parts pulled out of old televisions on eBay. He'll sell globally, but I believe most of his, if I recall correctly, most of the sales are obviously going to be concentrated within North America. But I distinctly recall him when I was there the last time shipping some stuff to Argentina, for example. So there's demand around the world for parts. People want parts to fix things. And so people are pulling them from used equipment. And it's funny, Robin didn't invent this. He got the idea by, traveling to developing countries and seeing, television repair guys, say in Ghana or in China or wherever it is, pull parts out of their devices. So, but there's a problem. And that is, and I think some folks at Samsung will know this, is that the demand for repair for a device, whether it's a TV, a computer, a phone, it peaks at a certain point in the United States and then it starts going down. And what Robin has found is, after a few years, a board for a television, a board, to repair, a laptop, there's just no demand for it in the US anymore. But, after going to Ghana and spending time there, he realized those used working machines, even new machines, are going over there and they want those boards. And so I happened to be there for this. This is Robin on the right, and on the left is Wahab Mohammed. If you've read my new book, you'll learn a bunch about Wahab. He's a wonderful, wonderful guy, one of my favorite people in the world. And he's a trader. He's a Ghanaian American. He goes back and forth between Vermont and Boston and Ghana, basically buying in the US used electronics and throwing in some furniture and stuff in the containers as well if there's some extra space, and selling it into Ghana. And he had started out doing whole units, meaning televisions, laptops, whatever, used working stuff that can and tested stuff that can be sold right away. But he and Robin began to see the same opportunity, which is, what if we try out selling parts? And so what Robin did, and I was there when they decided to do this, is they basically loaded up a couple of suitcases full of parts that Wahab took back to Ghana to see if his network of repair shops, wholesalers, retailers had any interest in getting their hands on the stuff. I remember I was at the airport with him. He bought a couple of extra suitcase allotments on Delta. Whatever it was, $90 a pop, and took the stuff back to Ghana. And you can see him here. I wasn't there for this, but here he is showing a Wudu Pond, who is probably the greatest repair guy in all of Ghana, which is really saying something. He's one of the leaders of the Repair Association in Kumasi, which is one of the centers of electronics repair in all of Africa. And he was checking this stuff out and giving Wahab some advice on what he wants. And he took a bunch of it and he was able to sell it, and they were able to sell it profitably. And so that has become a business. I've talked to a big retailer in the US. I talked to them about this. I gave a presentation there and they said, well, how do we get into this? We'd like to sell parts, into, Tamale and Savalugu too. It's not there yet. I mean, you're dealing one-on-one. It's a small scale business. Maybe at some point, these older generation devices, the parts demand will be such and it'll consolidate such that, bigger companies can get involved in it. But right now, it's a very sort of, I wouldn't say peer-to-peer, but it's bigger than that, but it's small. But the interesting thing is the demand is there, and big things sometimes start from very modest beginnings. The U.S.-China scrap trade, the first shipments that came, it was one-on-one and it was very small, and nobody would have guessed that it would have supplied China with 40% of its copper by the the early 2000s, and who knows where a trade like this can go. There's people, of course, listening today who know far more about the life cycle of electronics than I do, and probably have some thoughts on how long these devices can last. But when you have 35-year-old CRTs still being repaired in northern Ghana, it does tell you that the economic circumstances are such that there's a desire to keep these devices, which were never designed to last that long, going, and folks want these parts. And so it's not going to replace recycling by any stretch, but it is one route, I guess you could say, and one niche that sort of nibbles away at things. And from a sustainability perspective, and I know Samsung's very interested in sustainability. I am. I mean, a lot of my career is about it. It's something that is worth thinking about and just considering as to where sort of the global electronics trade is going, and especially used electronics, which is a very fast growing side of the electronics trade. I'm going to end with a chart. I try not to begin with charts because I usually lose people, but this sort of makes the point in a very global way that I want to make to you today. Let me explain what you see going on in the spaghetti. It's actually pretty simple and interesting. This is a map of sorts of global e-waste as it flowed around the world in 1996. Now, what you have here, if you look at the blue circles, those are countries, the United States, there's European countries, Japan is in there, Australia's there. The blue dots, circles, are countries that export e-waste. And the blue lines are when they export e-waste to each other. So the US exporting e-waste to Belgium, it actually sends quite a bit to Belgium to be refined there. So, and the bigger the circle, the more they export. Then you have the yellow circles. Those are countries that receive electronics, and they're net receivers of electronics. And those are emerging market countries, developing countries. So you can see China's in there, Indonesia's in there. And then you have these green and yellow lines. The green lines is what happens when a country like the US exports to developing country. So developed country to developing country. Okay, and you see, and the thicker the line, the bigger the volume of the trade. And then the lines that are really interesting to me are the yellow lines. That's when developing countries send electronic waste to other developing countries. And that always sort of throws people back on their heels, because the way we've learned to talk about e-waste is it's something that developed countries send or dump onto developing countries. But even as far back as 1996, it was pretty clear to those looking at the trade data and working with it that there was something more subtle going on. And I should credit this right now to Josh Leposki, who's a geographer in Newfoundland. Now look what happened over the next few years. I'm going to go from 1996 to 2012. What you see is a lot more yellow, and that's really interesting because it tells you something about the global economy. Certainly, there is still a lot of blue, but the green lines aren't as wide. And you see some blue between blue countries and developing countries. But what has really happened is that developing countries, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Zimbabwe, Madagascar, they're starting to trade e-waste between each other. developing countries trading it with developing countries. Why? Well, there's a few reasons, but one is the desire for the secondhand components, the parts. Repair parts, sometimes these are parts used to manufacture new things. So there's an element of fraud maybe, further down into the supply chain, but they're still using it. And it's an interesting phenomenon because it tells you there's, again, this huge desire, hunger for secondhand parts around the world. And it's sort of the global version of what I was showing you happening in Ghana, or just between Tamale and Savalugu, where, Ibrahim al-Hassan might go to Tamale or Kumasi to buy parts from, a Wudu Pond. So, this is, where this goes, nobody knows, but I think you're going to see more and more of this kind of trade in coming years. And it's something I wanted to leave with you as we think about the future of sustainability on Earth Day as it relates to electronics. Again, Star Wars inspired a lot of my thinking on this. I'm not arguing that it is a solution, but I do think it's going to be a growing and increasing part of the sustainable solution to what we do with this excess waste that we have. And so I'll end with an image of Ray, because she's sort of, as I said, my spirit animal for recycling. I mean, I think she is a vision, at least partly, of the future. Rather than cutting apart that giant Star Destroyer, she's going in for the high value stuff, the parts. So, this is the book in which I really thought through a lot of these, and I'm really glad to hear you'll be raffling off some of these. I hope folks get a chance to give it a read. It was a lot of fun to write, and the folks I've spoken to have really enjoyed reading it.